So now we have talked about skeletal muscle fiber structure. We've talked about the structure of skeletal muscle fibers. We've talked really about how they contract and how they generate force. But we haven't talked about what actually initiates the contraction of those fibers, and that's what this lecture is dedicated to. So to understand what initiates the contraction of muscle fibers, what you have to do is you first of all have to go into the nervous system, and you have to look at something that's called the cerebrum, which is right here. Most people think about the cerebrum as being the whole brain, but it's actually not. There's multiple different parts to the brain. The cerebrum is just one of them. Anyways, if you were to take the cerebrum right here, that's a lateral view. That would be looking at it from the side. And you were to cross-cut it. Right? This is actually what is referred to as a frontal or coronal cut. If you were to do that and cut it in half, right, into a front and a back half, an anterior and a posterior half, and then you were to look inside, like where you made that cut. So imagine, you've got your hand and you just pull off this front part of the cerebrum, and you were to look at, where you made that cut, either on the anterior half or the posterior half of the cerebrum. It actually makes absolutely no difference. If you were to look at where you made that cut, this is what you would see up here. Inside of the cerebrum, you would see that it's organized into mostly an outer layer of what's called gray matter and an inner layer of what's called white matter. Right? Can you see how the whole outside of the cerebrum is gray and the inside, we'll do in a different color, is white? Right? That's how the entire cerebrum is organized. It's not just this one place that this cut is being made. You could make this cut anywhere. You could make it here, you could make it here, you could make it here, here. It makes absolutely no difference. Cut any portion of the cerebrum into a front and a back half. Look inside, look at where you made that cut on, interiorly, and this is what you're going to see. You're going to see an outer layer of gray and an inner layer of white inside of the cerebrum. So first of all, let's just do the terminology and then talk about where the colors come from. The outer layer of the cerebrum here is referred to as the cerebral cortex. Cortex just means outer layer, like there's the adrenal cortex too, right? So that just means the outer layer of the adrenal gland. Right? If we say cerebral cortex, we mean the outer layer of the cerebrum, right? This structure right here that we're looking at. And what do we know about the cerebral cortex? The cerebral cortex is a layer of gray matter. That's very, very important to recognize. The cerebral cortex is the outer layer of the cerebrum, just like the adrenal cortex is the outer layer of the adrenal gland. Anytime you hear cortex, there's a cortex to the kidneys too. It's an outer layer. Anytime you hear cerebral cortex, it means the outer layer of the cerebrum, this part of the brain, and it's made up of gray matter. Okay, so what is the gray matter and what is the white matter? I know that we're focusing on the cerebral cortex, but this applies to anywhere in the nervous system as well. Okay, when you see gray matter, what you are looking at are the cell bodies of neurons. Sometimes you're looking at whole neurons, but in that case, the axon also needs to be unmyelinated. So generally speaking, when you look at gray matter, and so what we mean here is if we're looking at this cerebral cortex or anywhere else that there's gray matter, what you're actually seeing are the cell bodies of neurons for the most part. Okay? Cell bodies and dendrites of neurons. When you look at white matter, what you're seeing are axons of neurons, and they have to be myelinated. So again, when you look at white matter, you see this anywhere in the nervous system. This doesn't just apply to the cerebrum. But when you see white matter, you're looking at a whole bunch of axons together that are all myelinated. So where does the color difference come from? And this is easiest to do by talking about white matter. So why is white matter white? White matter is white because white matter is made up of a whole bunch of axons that are myelinated. And myelin is a lipid, it's fat. And solid fat appears white. Think about looking at a steak, think about looking at butter. It has a whitish appearance to it. And since, white matter is a whole bunch of axons all together, and the axons within that white matter are myelinated, and myelin is a type of fat, and fat appears white, that causes white matter to have a white appearance to it. It's all about the fact that the axons within the white matter are essentially covered in fat, which is myelin. And the gray matter appears gray because, well, it's cell bodies and dendrites which aren't covered in myelin or fat, and so they have this more gray appearance to them. So overall, what this tells us about the whole cerebrum is that the whole cerebrum is organized so that the outer layer of the cerebrum, the cerebral cortex, is really for the most part made up of the cell bodies of neurons. Okay? And also some whole neurons that have unmyelinated axons. That's what the cerebral cortex is, and that's also why it appears gray. And the second thing that this tells us about the cerebrum is that the core of the cerebrum, right, the center of the cerebrum, is really all axons, right, and specifically myelinated axons, right, that are wrapped in fat, and thus that's why it appears white. And this organization of the cerebrum, the fact that we know that the outer layer of the cerebrum is mostly made up of cell bodies and the core of the cerebrum is mostly made up of myelinated axons, this actually allows us to understand both motor and sensory pathways. It allows us to make a lot of sense of them. So what we are going to focus on in this lecture are motor pathways, because that's how we get muscle fibers to contract. Motor pathways are exactly what they sound like. If something is motor, it sends information, just like a neuron, it sends information from the central nervous system outward. So motor pathways start in the central nervous system, oftentimes up in the cerebrum. And those motor pathways start in the central nervous system, like the cerebrum, and then they make their way out to the periphery of the body. That's where the idea of a motor pathway comes from. And the major point to make here is this organization of gray and white matter in the cerebrum makes complete sense for this motor pathway. It actually makes sense for the sensory pathway too, but we're not talking about that right now. So how does this structure of the cerebrum with gray and white matter make sense for motor pathways? And it's fairly straightforward. If the cerebral cortex is gray matter, and thus it's made up of cell bodies, and the core of the cerebrum is white matter, and thus it's made up of axons, then how does this organization of the cerebrum actually relate to motor pathways? Okay? Well, think about it. These neurons up here that start, their cell bodies, start in the cerebral cortex, right? Because these neuron cell bodies are located in the cerebral cortex. And that's, why the cerebral cortex appears gray, is because, well, these neuronal cell bodies are up there. Now, where do their axons go? Their axons of these particular neurons, right, they project into the core of the cerebrum and travel down the spinal cord. Since the axons of these neurons are myelinated, and the axons travel into the core of the cerebrum, that makes the core of the cerebrum appear white. Because what is white matter? White matter is a whole bunch of axons that are all myelinated together. Okay, so that explains again this organization of gray matter that is the cerebral cortex and white matter that is the core of the cerebrum, and this also helps explain a motor pathway. Right, this organization helps explain the motor pathway, because if we were going to have a motor pathway, what would we have? We'd have neurons that must start up in the cerebrum, and in this case, the cell bodies are located in the cerebral cortex. And then we would have their axons project into the core of the cerebrum, down the spinal cord, and ultimately pass information out to the periphery of the body. That would be the definition of a motor pathway. So this organization of the cerebrum makes perfect sense for how we would think a motor pathway would work, right? If you want to send information from the central nervous system out to the periphery of the body, this, I would think, would be the exact kind of pathway anyone would imagine, right? The neurons themselves would start, they'd originate up in the, kind of outer layers of the cerebrum. That's where their cell bodies would be, and that makes the outer layer of the cerebrum, the cerebral cortex, appear gray. And then we would expect their axons to kind of project into the core of the cerebrum and down the spinal cord. And because their axons are myelinated, that makes that area ultimately, again, appear white. But this organization makes complete sense, because if you want these neurons that I would think you could imagine stored up in the brain, up in the cerebrum, to send information out towards the periphery of the body, this is the exact path that they would need to take. They would need their axons to go into the core of the cerebrum, down the spinal cord, and then pass the information outward via nerves, specifically to axons that exist, to neurons that exist within those nerves. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself because I realize some of you haven't taken anatomy, so the entirety of this may not be setting in exactly just yet. So let's keep explaining it some more. This is an image of the cerebrum again. It's a lateral view of the cerebrum. But now it's all colored in. The different portions of the cerebrum appear to be colored in the image. And what's actually being colored in are the different portions of the cerebral cortex. The outer layer of gray matter where all those cell bodies and sometimes whole neurons that are unmyelinated exist. But why color it in? And it's because we know that different portions of the cerebral cortex do different things. And before even saying that, maybe I need to emphasize the fact that the cerebral cortex is really responsible for most of what we think about with regard to human existence. Different portions of the cerebral cortex, yet again, that outer layer of gray matter where the cell bodies are located, within the cerebrum, it's responsible, different portions of it, for movement of the human body, which is what we're going to focus on, but critical thinking skills, hearing, seeing, speaking, decision making, personality, also emotions, really most of what we think about with regard to human existence, we can tie so much of it to the cerebral cortex. And we know that different portions of the cerebral cortex do different things, and that is what this image is showing you. What it's highlighting, I know it looks like it's highlighting the whole cerebrum, but what it's doing is it's highlighting actually different portions specifically of the cerebral cortex and acknowledging, kind of what their major function is, what that portion of the cerebral cortex mostly does. We are only interested in a very small part of this, because you could spend a lifetime talking about what the different portions of the cerebral cortex do. Okay, we're interested in one small part. And in order to find that part for now, here's what we need to do. This is what's called the central sulcus. This is a valley. And what it does is it separates the anterior half of the cerebrum from the posterior half of the cerebrum. And we can use that central sulcus to find the specific part of the cerebral cortex that we're interested in. Because if we go right in front of the central sulcus, you can see it highlighted in red here, we find something that's known as the primary motor cortex. I know, by the way, this is a lateral view. This would be the left side of the cerebrum, but please know that this extends on the right side as well. We'll look at that in just a second. Okay. If you find the central sulcus, this valley that separates the anterior from posterior cerebrum, and you just go a little bit in front of it, you find the primary motor cortex. What the primary motor cortex is it's a portion of the cerebral cortex that controls all of the skeletal muscles in the human body. There are a couple exceptions to this rule, but it's pretty easy to generalize and say that this portion of the cerebral cortex, right, this is just a small part of that gray matter that exists in the outer layer of the cerebrum. This part of it generally controls all of the skeletal muscles that exist in the entire human body. So the central sulcus, if you look down here, it's right here. Okay? This is the central sulcus. Okay? Right in front of the central sulcus is where the primary motor cortex is. So if we wanted to actually see the primary motor cortex, here's what we'd have to do. We'd have to take this cut right here, and we'd have to move it. And we'd have to cut along the central sulcus. And let's pretend that we did that. Let's pretend that we cut along the central sulcus, and we're able to divide the brain into an anterior and posterior half. Cut along the central sulcus. Cut along the central sulcus, and then remove the anterior half of the cerebrum. If you were to do that, and then you were to take this anterior half of the cerebrum, flip it around, and look at where you just made that cut, this is what you would see, right? Except, more specifically, this is what you would see. This is an actual depiction of the primary motor cortex. I don't love that it's only 1/2 of the primary motor cortex, but that's what your textbook does. So to get here, what are we doing? Like, again, up here, that's a superior view of the cerebrum. If you were to look at the cerebrum from, kind of over the top of it, this is what you would see. And what your text is trying to show you is that a cut is being made along the central sulcus, right? That's where this cut is being made. It's along the central sulcus, and we know right in front of the central sulcus is the primary motor cortex. So what's actually happening is, the way that your text is showing you, is that a cut is being made along the central sulcus, and then the front half of the cerebrum is being pulled off, right? And then you're flipping it around and you're looking at where the cut was made, and you're seeing what would actually be the entire thing, not just half of it, but you're seeing now the primary motor cortex. This portion of the cerebral cortex that exists right in front of the central sulcus that controls all of the skeletal muscles in the human body. So again, since the primary motor cortex is a portion of the cerebral cortex, it's just gray matter, right? It's highlighted in red here. This is the whole primary motor cortex. It's a section of gray matter, right? And is thus part of the cerebral cortex that lies right in front of the central sulcus. And of course, it would extend into this side as well, but that's not what the image does, so whatever. What you're seeing here is actually what's called the motor homunculus. What the motor homunculus does is it depicts the primary motor cortex, which is what's being done here. It's depicting the primary motor cortex, and it's showing what different portions of the primary motor cortex do. We actually know which portions of the primary motor cortex control which muscles. The very medial, let's highlight this, up here in red. The medial portion, black, excuse me, the medial portions of the primary motor cortex control, for example, the foot muscles, the muscles around the knee and legs. And then as you move from medial to lateral, you start seeing that the primary motor cortex in these regions start controlling, for example, the arm, shoulder, wrist, hands. And then as you get really lateral, this portion of the primary motor cortex controls the facial muscles. All the motor homunculus does is it shows you which portions of the primary motor cortex control which muscles, right? So again, up here in black, as we move from medial to more and more lateral, right, away from the midline, we see that the primary motor cortex goes from controlling, kind of the more so lower extremities to more and more of the upper extremities as we move from medial to lateral. And what that really means is it means these neurons that make up the primary motor cortex are the ones that are ultimately controlling the activation of these different muscles. Because what is the primary motor cortex made up of? It's made up of the cell bodies of neurons, and the cell bodies of these neurons thus must be controlling these different muscles of the human body. And what we want to try to understand is how and why. So now you're seeing the entire primary motor cortex be depicted, which I much prefer, right? It would extend from about here all the way to over here. Okay, all of this gray matter would be the entire primary motor cortex. That region of gray matter, the region of the cerebral cortex that's right in front of the central sulcus. And it's trying to depict how this region controls the activation of skeletal muscle fibers out in your body. And ultimately, this brings us back to the entire organization of the cerebrum as a whole, right? Because what is the primary motor cortex made up of? Right? It's made up of these cell bodies because it's gray matter. Right? It's a portion of the cerebral cortex, right? So it's made up of cell bodies of neurons. That's what gray matter is. And then where must the axons of these neurons within the primary motor cortex go? Their axons must project into the core of the cerebrum and down the spinal cord. That's what's being depicted in this image. The neurons that start up in the primary motor cortex, that's where their cell bodies are, their axons project into the core of the cerebrum and down the spinal cord. And that's a big part of why this particular section would have this appearance of gray and white, right? The primary motor cortex would appear gray because it's all cell bodies. And the core of the cerebrum would appear white because the axons that are myelinated of these neurons within the primary motor cortex are extending into it. And since the axons of these neurons that start up in the primary motor cortex are myelinated, that creates a white appearance, and the core of the cerebrum and portions of the spinal cord, for that matter, appear white. So let's look at a different angle. Here's a lateral view again. This is the central sulcus. Right in front of the central sulcus is the primary motor cortex. We know that the primary motor cortex is made up of cell bodies. Okay, it's gray matter. And we know that the axons of these cell bodies project into the core of the cerebrum, right? The axons are myelinated, so the core of the cerebrum is white. Now, where are these axons going to go beyond just the core of the cerebrum? And the answer is they're going to start traveling down the spinal cord. Different neurons within the primary motor cortex are going to travel different lengths down the spinal cord. Some will travel only a very short distance into the spinal cord, and some will travel really far down into the spinal cord. It all depends, does the neuron in the primary motor cortex result, in the activation of muscles that are in the lower extremities, or does the primary motor cortex neuron result in the activation of muscles in the upper extremities? That will dictate how far down the spinal cord it ultimately travels, and I will explain why that is the case to you right now. So, where do these neurons that start in the primary motor cortex terminate? Meaning, like, where are their axon terminals? Their axon terminals are located in the spinal cord, right? Their cell bodies start up in the primary motor cortex, then their axons travel through the core of the cerebrum into the spinal cord, and then we're actually going to find their axon terminals in the spinal cord somewhere. It depends which, again, muscle are they going to result in the activation of. For those of you that have, again, taken anatomy, the cervical nerves, the nerves that are, attached to the upper portions of the spinal cord, the cervical nerves take neurons out to muscles mostly of the upper extremities. And our lumbar nerves, meaning the nerves that attach to the lower portions of the spinal cord, take neurons out to the muscles mostly of the lower extremities. So the point is, if there's a neuron in the primary motor cortex, for example, that is going to result in activation of muscle fibers within the biceps muscle, then its axon doesn't need to travel very far down the spinal cord. It's only going to travel into the cervical region of the spinal cord. Now, if you have a neuron in the primary motor cortex that's going to result in the activation of the gastroc, right, the major calf muscle, then that primary motor cortex neuron, its axon is going to travel way down into the spinal cord before it actually stops, terminates. Okay? And why is that? Because all of these primary motor cortex neurons, what they do is they synapse with other neurons in the spinal cord. And that is what is actually being depicted in this image. We have to just pick a muscle. Okay, I always go with the biceps muscle, so let's stick with that. Okay, if you look at the motor homunculus, you'll notice that the more lateral region, it's not perfectly lateral, but it's not the furthest medial either. So it would probably be like around here. Okay. That region of the primary motor cortex, is what ultimately we know controls the biceps muscle. What that really means is neurons within approximately this region of the primary motor cortex are what control the activation of biceps muscle fibers. And we want to think, well, how do they do that? Okay, so neurons here, let's highlight it in green. Neurons here are the neurons in the primary motor cortex that are going to result in the activation of the biceps muscle fibers. Okay, so these neurons are going to travel a very short distance down the spinal cord before they synapse with the cell bodies and dendrites of other neurons in the spinal cord that actually travel out through our cervical nerves and to the biceps muscle. For those of you that have had anatomy, the cervical nerves that make up the brachial plexus are the nerves that actually feed neurons out to the, kind of the muscles of our, our arms, upper extremities. So the point is, these primary motor cortex neurons, these neurons up here in the primary motor cortex, they don't actually travel very far down the spinal cord before their axon terminals, are found synapsing with another neuron that is now going to travel out through the cervical nerves out to, again, muscles of the arm. So just to be clear, here are the spinal nerves. And you're actually seeing the spinal nerves here that travel out to the ultimately upper extremity. The specific nerve that travels to the biceps muscle is the musculocutaneous nerve. Okay. What travels through the musculocutaneous nerve? We went through this when we introduced the nervous system, but what travels through nerves? Neurons. Okay, and the neurons, their cell bodies and dendrites, are located in the spinal cord. Okay, and then their axons travel through the nerves out to the muscles. These are going to be those somatic motor neurons, the neurons that we have conscious control over, and we're about to explain how we have conscious control over them. It all relates to the activation of neurons in the primary motor cortex, okay? But I think it's important that you recognize the organization here, right? There's going to be spinal nerves that actually travel out to these different muscles of the body, and what travels through those nerves are neurons, right? And the cell bodies and dendrites of those neurons that travel through the nerves we find sitting in the spinal cord. So the job, ultimately, of the neurons that start up in the primary motor cortex is to travel down the spinal cord and activate past action potentials to the neurons that sit in the spinal cord and have axons that travel out to the nerves that then go to the muscles. That is what's actually being depicted in this image, right? Here's a neuron that starts in the primary motor cortex, right? Its cell body and dendrites are located in the primary motor cortex. The primary motor cortex is gray because it's made up of cell bodies and dendrites, okay? Then its axon travels through the core of the cerebrum. It's myelinated, makes the core of the cerebrum white, and its axon actually then travels down into the spinal cord. And somewhere in the spinal cord, it all depends upon, again, which muscle it's involved in activating. Somewhere in the spinal cord, it terminates, meaning its axon terminals, this, again, primary motor cortex neurons, axon terminals, are actually located in the spinal cord. And in the spinal cord, the axon terminals synapse with a somatic motor neuron. The other word that we use for these somatic motor neurons, these neurons that travel out through a nerve to a specific muscle, is also alpha motor neurons. Okay, it means the same thing. They're also called alpha motor neurons. You could call them somatic motor neurons, you could call them alpha motor neurons, it doesn't matter. These are the neurons that sit in the spinal cord, right? Their cell bodies and dendrites, and then their axons travel through some specific nerve out to a specific muscle where they synapse with muscle fibers in that muscle. Okay? Let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. What I want to continuously drive home is the point that these neurons up here in the primary motor cortex, the job of these neurons in the primary motor cortex is to pass action potentials to these alpha motor neurons all throughout the spinal cord. Okay? And which alpha motor neurons is a specific primary motor cortex neuron going to pass an action potential to? It all depends upon which muscle that primary motor cortex neuron is involved in activating. Again, let's stick with the biceps muscle, okay? So let's just pretend that this cell body is a little bit more medial because that's where it would need to be if it was going to be the one that's involved in activating the biceps muscle. But let's just pretend that, okay? Its cell body and dendrite is up in the primary motor cortex. Then its axon travels through the core of the cerebrum, down the spinal cord, and it will travel just into the cervical region of the spinal cord before it synapses with the, I'm going to say this in a, as if it's plural, which it is, but that's going to sound a little bit confusing for the moment. Don't let it confuse you, because we'll get to it eventually. It's this primary motor cortex neuron is going to synapse with the alpha motor neurons. There's going to be many of them that ultimately travel out through the musculocutaneous nerve to the biceps muscle fibers. So these alpha motor neurons, these somatic motor neurons that travel out through the musculocutaneous nerve to the biceps muscle, they all sit kind of about here in the spinal cord. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, that's about right. Most of the alpha motor neurons that travel out through the musculocutaneous nerve to the biceps muscle sit in the spinal cord about right here. And then their axons project through the musculocutaneous nerve and travel out to the biceps muscle where they're going to synapse with muscle fibers. Okay, but you've got to get those alpha motor neurons to generate action potentials, right? This is the first step. It's really kind of the second step in getting the muscle fibers within the biceps muscle to actually contract. You need to get the alpha motor neurons that travel through the musculocutaneous nerve out to those biceps muscle fibers to start generating action potentials. And these primary motor cortex neurons are the ones that accomplish it. These neurons in the primary motor cortex are going to generate action potentials, and they're ultimately going to pass those action potentials to the alpha motor neurons in the spinal cord that travel out through the musculocutaneous nerve to the biceps muscle. So maybe the question is, to start off, what causes the primary motor cortex neurons to generate these action potentials in the first place? And the answer is there needs to be some conscious thought about, in this case, flexing the elbow, right? Because when the biceps muscle contracts, it results in elbow flexion, at least a concentric contraction, as we'll talk about later on. You have to have a conscious thought that you want to flex your elbow and lift something. Maybe that's picking a glass up or picking a pen up. I don't know. There needs to be some conscious decision to lift an object with your hand, which then requires elbow flexion and thus contraction of the biceps muscle. So, you say to yourself, I want to pick up that glass to take a drink of water. There's going to be an interplay of many, many neurons generating action potentials, right? Neurons in the primary visual cortex are going to start generating action potentials, assuming the person can see, because, right, they're going to be visualizing the object, and the visualization of something involves action potentials of neurons as well in different regions of the cerebral cortex. And then you have to make this conscious decision about what to do with that object that you're seeing, which requires many other action potentials by other neurons in the cerebral cortex. But ultimately, what will happen down the line is some other neuron within the cerebral cortex will pass an action potential to this neuron in the primary motor cortex that's involved in controlling the biceps muscle, causing the biceps muscle to contract, right? You make that conscious decision that you want to contract your biceps muscle to produce elbow flexion and lift the glass to take a drink. And again, somewhere down the line, this neuron in the primary motor cortex will generate an action potential. And when this primary motor cortex neuron generates an action potential, that action potential will travel down its axon, which travels into the cervical region of the spinal cord, and that is where it synapses with alpha motor neurons that travel out through the musculocutaneous nerve to the biceps muscle. And what the primary motor cortex neuron will do is, of course, pass that action potential to the alpha motor neuron. How does it do it? It uses the excitatory neurotransmitter glutamate, right? The primary motor cortex neuron releases glutamate from its axon terminals through the process that we've gone through in this course. And glutamate binds to ligand-gated channels on the dendrites of this alpha motor neuron, this somatic motor neuron in the spinal cord. That allows sodium to shoot in to this alpha motor neuron and cause this alpha motor neuron thus to generate an action potential, right? If we get enough sodium into the axon hillock region of the alpha motor neuron, then the alpha motor neuron will generate an action potential. And if the alpha motor neuron, the somatic motor neuron, generates this action potential, where's the action potential go? It goes down its axon, and its axon travels through the musculocutaneous nerve out to the biceps muscle. And this alpha motor neuron, once it gets to the biceps muscle, its axon terminals will synapse with a given number of muscle fibers inside of the biceps muscle. Remember, inside of the biceps muscle, there are hundreds of thousands of muscle fibers. And this one alpha motor neuron might synapse with 10, 20, 30. We'll get to this conversation again. I keep saying this, but later on, actually in this same chapter in the coming lectures. But there's a finite number of muscle fibers that will actually synapse with, right? Once you get to its axon terminals, it'll have, a certain number of axon terminals that synapse with a certain number of muscle fibers within the biceps muscle. So to provide a little bit of a different view of these neurons that control the biceps muscle in the primary motor cortex would be right about there, right? And their axons would travel through the core of the cerebrum and down into the cervical region of the spinal cord, somewhere in this region right here. And in this cervical region is where they would synapse, pass action potentials to the alpha motor neurons or somatic motor neurons that travel out through the musculocutaneous nerve to the biceps muscle. Now what's being depicted in this image is an alpha motor neuron or a somatic motor neuron synapsing with a skeletal muscle fiber. In our example, this would be a skeletal muscle fiber within the biceps muscle. And this is one alpha motor neuron, right? Its axon terminals, some of its axon terminals, synapsing with this muscle fiber. You can probably imagine this alpha motor neuron is going to pass an action potential to this muscle fiber and allow this muscle fiber to contract within the biceps muscle. And that's what the next lecture is going to be about. And let me finish with the final note that I hope the term somatic motor neuron makes sense to you now, right? A motor neuron is just one that travels from the central nervous system out towards the periphery. Somatic motor neurons are the motor neurons that we have conscious control over, and they're the ones that travel out to our skeletal muscle fibers. The reason that we have, the reason that we call them somatic motor neurons is, again, because we have conscious control over them. We have conscious control over them, and thus we have conscious control over when the skeletal muscles in our body contract. You can make a conscious decision to activate these alpha motor neurons, these somatic motor neurons, right? You just say to yourself, for example, in our example, I want to produce elbow flexion to lift a glass up to take a drink. Right? In order to do that, you have to contract your biceps muscle. In order to contract your biceps muscle, you need neurons in the primary motor cortex to generate action potentials, and you need neurons in the spinal cord called alpha motor neurons or somatic motor neurons to generate action potentials. And through your conscious thought, these neurons up in the primary motor cortex and in the spinal cord, alpha motor neurons generate action potentials and allow for your skeletal muscles to contract. That is where the term comes from. One more. It's another definitional thing. You hear the term motor pathway a lot, and I hope it makes sense now what a motor pathway is and how the organization of the cerebrum allows for these motor pathways, right? A motor pathway is any pathway that kind of sends information from somewhere in the central nervous system out towards the periphery of the body, like out towards our skeletal muscle. And this organization allows for that perfectly because these neurons cell body, the neuron cell bodies, start up in the outer layers of the cerebrum called the cerebral cortex, the gray matter. And then their axons project into the core of the cerebrum, making it white, and down into the spinal cord. and then they pass that information to other neurons, which travel through nerves and pass that information out to the periphery. This organization of the cerebrum into gray and white matter makes perfect sense for our comprehension of how motor pathways work. If you want to send information from the central nervous system out into the periphery of the body, this is exactly how you would expect the pathway to be organized, with the cell bodies way up in the outer layers of the brain, the cerebrum, the axons projecting down into the spinal cord, and then passing the information out through other neurons to the periphery of the body. I know I said this earlier, but I'm going to say it again. This actual organization of the cerebrum also perfectly allows us to understand sensory pathways as well. We just haven't gotten there yet.